YouTube, this is a lecture on Anatomy and Physiology Chapter 5, the integumentary system. This system is collectively known as the skin, hair, glands, and nails, so please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and let's get started. The skin, also known as the cutaneous membrane, is the largest organ of the human body, making up 10 to 15% of our total body weight. And there are two main components of the skin, the dermis and the epidermis. The epidermis, epi meaning top, dermis meaning skin, is the most superficial layer of the skin. It is the part of the skin that you see every day. The epidermis consists of keratinized stratified epithelium, and like all epithelia, the epidermis is avascular, meaning that it lacks blood vessels. The dermis, which lies below the epidermis, consists of both loose connective tissue and dense irregular tissue. Within the dermis and the epidermis, we will find the skin's accessory structures, such as the hair, nails, and glands. Within the skin, you'll also find sensory receptors and erector pili muscles. Deep to the dermis, there's the hypodermis, hypo meaning below, dermis meaning skin. The hypodermis is below the skin but is actually not a part of the skin. Its function is to anchor the skin and the muscles together. So if you look at this figure here on the right, you can see that the hypodermis has a rich supply of blood vessels. This makes the hypodermis a good place to administer medicine. And this yellow substance here is adipose tissue known as fat. And whenever you see a yellow structure within an anatomy figure, fat is usually what it represents. Also, the epidermis and the dermis both have their own sublayers, which we'll discuss those in a few. There are 5 main functions of the skin, and the most obvious one, of course, would be protection. The skin protects underlying structures from trauma and injuries, and the skin also houses immune cells to attack pathogens before they can invade underlying tissues. Sebaceous glands help the skin to maintain an acidic pH, which will create a hostile environment for pathogens, preventing them from growing on the skin. The skin also protects against environmental damage. For example, the skin absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun to stop it from damaging underlying tissues. Sensation is also a function of the skin, and this function is carried out by the sensory receptors. Thermoregulation is another function of the skin, and it helps the body to maintain a stable internal temperature through negative feedback loops. And this is a very important function because it helps the body to maintain homeostasis. The skin also excretes waste and toxins out of the body, and this process is called excretion. And last but not least, vitamin D synthesis. The skin plays a huge role in the synthesizing of vitamin D. Cholesterol is the precursor form of vitamin D, meaning that vitamin D begins in the body as cholesterol. Cholesterol is found in the epidermis of the skin. And whenever the sun hits the skin, cholesterol is converted into cholecalciferol. After cholecalciferol enters the bloodstream, it will then get modified into calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. This modification is done by the liver and the kidneys. Within the epidermis, you will find these cells called keratinocytes. Remember that keratin is a fibrous protein that toughens tissue and makes tissue more resistant to stress. These cells alone help to make the epidermis stronger and more resistant to mechanical trauma. Keratinocytes are joined by tight intracellular junctions called desmosomes. These desmosomes also contribute to the firm structure of the epidermis. These keratinocytes make up a majority of all the cells in the epidermis and are arranged into strata or layers. These are the layers of the epidermis, starting with the most superficial layer to the deepest. The stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the deepest layer, which is the stratum basale. Now, I know that a lot of people dissect the layers of the epidermis from deepest to most superficial, but I'm going to do mine differently. I'm going to start with the most superficial layer and work my way downward to the deepest layer versus upward. Because when you switch things up a bit, it increases your understanding. So let's start with the stratum corneum of the epidermis. The stratum corneum is the most superficial layer of the epidermis. It consists of dead flattened keratinocytes. Keratinocytes in the stratum corneum usually shed due to lost desmosomes. And remember, we said the desmosomes are the tight intracellular junctions that hold keratinocytes together. And on average, a person will shed 1 million keratinocytes a day and 8 pounds a year. So never let anyone tell you that you're not losing weight. The stratum lucidum is the layer underneath the stratum corneum, and it consists of a clear layer of dead keratinocytes. The stratum lucidum is the layer found in thick skin, which we'll discuss in just a second. The stratum granulosum is the middle layer of the epidermis and consists of 3 to 5 rows of keratinocytes. The stratum granulosum is named because of its large granules inside of its cells, and these cells release a lipid-based substance through exocytosis. This lipid-based substance coats the keratinocytes of the epidermis, and remember that lipids are hydrophobic, meaning they go against any water-soluble substance. So this lipid-based substance will act as a water barrier to prevent water-soluble substances from passing out of the skin or entering the skin. The stratum spinosum is located underneath the stratum basale, and it is the thickest layer of the epidermis, containing 8 to 10 layers of cells. It's named due to its cells that have a spiky or spiny appearance. Now, these cells look spiky after preparation for a microscope, but in living tissue they do not look spiky. Since the stratum spinosum is near the blood supply, its cells are metabolically active and can undergo mitosis. This layer of the epidermis also helps to produce vitamin D. The stratum basale is the deepest layer of the epidermis and has 1 layer of stem cells. The keratinocytes in this layer of the epidermis are closer to the blood supply in the dermis. So these cells are the most metabolically active and the most active in mitosis. And this is why the stratum basale is also called the stratum germinativum, because this layer houses germinating cells. Keratinocytes in the stratum basale also synthesize vitamin D whenever the skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Keratinocytes undergo their own life cycle. They're produced in the stratum spinosum of the epidermis. They shed in the stratum corneum of the epidermis due to environmental stress, physical trauma, or just from being old. When they shed, new cells have to be replaced to maintain the structure of the epidermis. So these keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum and the stratum basale will undergo cell division, aka mitosis. Because remember, these cells only undergo mitosis in layers of the epidermis where there is blood supply. When new keratinocytes are made, the ones above them are pushed upward toward the top layers of the epidermis. This is done to make sure the cells maintain a certain thickness. Besides keratinocytes, there are other types of cells in the epidermis. There are dendritic cells, which are phagocytic immune cells that protect the skin and underlying tissue from pathogens. There are Merkel cells, which function to detect touch, shapes, textures. They can be found in different parts of the body, such as the fingertips, lips, and hair on the scalp. And then there are melanocytes, which are responsible for producing the melanin protein. Interestingly enough, even the skin has its own types. There's thick skin on some parts of the body and thin skin found on other parts of the body. This is because certain parts of the body are more susceptible to mechanical stress. So in these locations, we find thick skin. Thick skin is made up of all 5 layers of the epidermis and a very thick layer of the stratum corneum. Thick skin can be compared to the size of a paper towel. This type of skin contains sweat glands but lacks hair follicles, meaning that hair does not grow on thick skin. Thin skin, on the other hand, does not have all 5 layers of the epidermis because it lacks the stratum lucidum layer. This type of skin is exposed to less mechanical stress and can be compared to the size of a sheet of printing paper. Hair does grow on thin skin and has both sebaceous glands and sweat glands. Now, both thick and thin skin can develop extra layers of the stratum corneum when exposed to too much pressure. This will result in something that we know as a callus. And again, as you guys can see in these photos here on the bottom right, the stratum corneum layer in thick skin is way thicker than the layer of stratum corneum in thick skin. And thin skin does not have the stratum lucidum layer, while the thick skin does have the stratum lucidum layer. So yes, thick skin and thin skin are layered differently from one another. Below the epidermis in all of its layers, you'll find the dermis. The dermis is the second layer of the skin and functions to house blood supply and anchor the epidermis in place. You can also find sensory receptors within the dermis, and like the epidermis, the dermis also has its own layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. However, the two aren't necessarily layers, but they're really just 2 different types of connective tissue. The most superficial layer of the dermis is the papillary layer. This layer is made up of loose connective tissue. And remember, in connective tissue, we find cells such as phagocytes and fibroblasts. So these are the same type of cells we can expect to find inside of the papillary layer of the dermis. Collagen fibers found in the papillary layer functions to hold the dermis and the epidermis together. But too much pressure or trauma in a certain area can disrupt the collagen fibers, causing the epidermis and the dermis to separate. This will lead to a blister. On top of the papillary layer, you'll find the dermal papillae. The dermal papillae houses capillaries that diffuse oxygen and nutrients. The dermal papillae also houses sensory receptors called Meissner corpuscles. These receptors respond to stimuli such as light touch and are found in various places of the body such as the face, the lips, and the fingertips. Underneath the papillary layer of the dermis, there is the reticular layer. It's the thickest layer of the dermis and is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. You'll find a lot more fibers in the reticular layer of the dermis than the papillary layer. These collagen fibers strengthen the dermis and protects deeper tissues from traumatic injuries. The reticular layer also houses elastic fibers, and these elastic fibers are here to help the skin to return back to its original shape after being stretched. Now, if there's extreme stretching, such as stretching that comes from a pregnancy or a weight gain, these elastic fibers could permanently tear, forming something that we know as stretch marks. There are also proteoglycan cells here that draw water into the ground substance of the dermis. This helps not only to moisturize the skin, but also to keep it firm. In the reticular layer of the dermis, you'll also find blood vessels, sweat glands, hairs, sebaceous glands, and sensory receptors. There is one main type of receptor in the reticular layer, and that is the Pacinian corpuscle. They are also sometimes called lamellated corpuscles, lamel meaning layered. They're named due to their layered appearance. They actually resemble onions when you view them in cross-section. They function to make the skin sensitive to vibration and changes in pressure. Skin markings show us the interactions between the dermis and the epidermis. They can be found on the palms of the hands and the plantars of the feet. Thick collagen fibers will arrange the dermal papillae found on the papillary layer of the dermis into dermal ridges. Now the epidermis will blend in with the structure of the dermal papillae that lies underneath of it. This is what forms epidermal ridges. Epidermal ridges function to increase the gripping ability of the hands and feet. Along the epidermal ridges, you'll find tiny sweat pores that excrete sweat. They form a thin film in between bundles of collagen fibers. You'll find gaps, and these gaps will indent, forming cleavage lines or tension lines. As the reticular layer anchors tightly to underlying structures, it will create a deep crease named flexure lines. So let's its colors. Melanin is a protein that is responsible for the pigment in the skin and other places of the body like the hair. Melanin is produced by melanocytes in the stratum basale of the epidermis. Melanin DNA mutations can occur from too much radiation, which could lead to cancerous cells. The skin produces more melanin the more it is exposed to sunlight. But remember, melanin can only protect us but from so much radiation. So of course, too much radiation still isn't good. Melanin also functions in vitamin D synthesis control. Though the body needs vitamin D, too much synthesis of vitamin D can lead to calcium imbalances in the body and kidney failure. Skin pigment isn't always evenly distributed throughout the skin. There can sometimes be less pigment in one area and more in another area. Moles, for example, are produced when there is a high amount of melanocytes proliferating in one spot. Freckles are produced when an area has a higher production of melanin. Then there's albinism, which is a condition in which melanocytes fail to produce the tyrosinase enzyme. Remember that tyrosinase catalyzes the melanin protein. With albinism at higher risk for keratinocyte damage from UV radiation. There are a few more pigments that contribute to skin color. There's keratin, which is a yellow-orange lipid-soluble molecule. It accumulates in the stratum corneum of the epidermis and is usually an iron-containing protein in our blood that binds and transports oxygen, also contributes to skin pigment. Hemoglobin is responsible for pinkish hues found in skin pigments. These two pigments may not play a big role in skin color, but they definitely contribute. Along with the skin, The hair is another important organ of the integumentary system. Hair is a small branching structure that projects from the skin's surface. It's found all over the body except the regions where there is thick skin, such as the lips and genitals. Hair helps the integumentary system to carry out its protective functions, for instance, the hair around the eyes. It helps to keep foreign substances out of the eyes. The hair in the nose prevents inhalation of insects and harmful particles. Hair on the head protects the body from UV radiation and abrasions. The hair also has sensory neurons that contribute to sensation, and this is going to allow the hair to sense changes in the environment. There are many supporting structures of the hair, with the root and the shaft of the hair being the main two segments. The shaft is the part of the hair that projects out of the skin. Here, all of the hair cells are dead. The root is the part of the hair that is embedded in the dermis. Here, you'll find living hair cells. The root is indented at its base by a projection from the dermis called hair papillae. The root matrix is the area of the hair that undergoes mitosis to make new hair cells. The root is embedded in the hair follicle. The hair follicle is an enfolding that surrounds the root of the hair. The epithelial root sheath has two components, the outer and the inner component, which attaches directly to the root itself. The dermal root sheath surrounds the epidermal root sheath. It's there to give the hair follicle support and separate it from the dermis. Attached to the dermal root sheath are small muscular bands called arrector pili. When these muscles contract, the hair will stand up and the skin that attaches to the muscle will indent. This creates an appearance that we know as goosebumps. One hair strand can be divided into 3 regions or layers: the medulla, which is the inner layer, the cortex, which is the middle layer, and the cuticle, which is the outer layer. The medulla is found only in thick hairs, such as the hairs on our head. They contain keratinocytes that have soft keratin. The cortex is structured into several organized layers. Here you'll find keratinocytes with hard keratin. Keratinocytes with hard keratin won't break or flake the way keratinocytes with soft keratin do. The cuticle is the most superficial layer of the hair, containing one layer of hard keratinocytes that overlap each other. When the outer cuticle becomes worn out, this can result in something that we know as split ends. The rate at which hair grows can vary, but on average, the hair grows about 1 to 1.5 centimeters per month. The hair grows using a 2-stage cycle. In the growth stage, cells are continuously engaging in cell division upward, away from the supply of blood. This causes the cells to keratinize and die. In the resting stage, the cells in the matrix will stop undergoing mitosis and die off. The hair follicle will shorten and become dormant for anywhere from 1 to 7 months. Different factors can influence hair growth, such as environment, genetics, diet, or age. For instance, hair growth can begin to slow down as a person gets up in age. Now, when hair begins to fall out faster than it grows, this is a condition called alopecia. So, as you guys probably know already, hair can come in numerous textures and colors. Hair colors and textures can vary depending on the type of hair that grows on your body. For example, there is a type of hair called lanugo. Lanugo is a thin, non-pigmented hair that covers the entire body of a fetus. This hair usually falls out by birth and is replaced by either terminal hair or vellus hair. Terminal hair is a thick, coarse type of hair and is well pigmented. This is the type of hair that is found on the scalp and around the eyes. Vellus hair is a thinner, non-pigmented type of hair that is found on the rest of the body. After puberty, vellus hair is usually replaced by terminal hair. Hair color is also determined by melanin. Melanocytes in the matrix of the hair produces melanin that interacts with keratin. As we age, melanocytes begin to produce less melanin, and this is what causes gray hair in older adults. Another to protect underlying tissues and enhances our ability to grip. Let's talk about the anatomy of the nail, starting with the nail plate. The nail plate sits on top of the nail bed and divides into the nail body and the nail root. The nail root lies underneath the skin, and within it you'll find the nail matrix. The nail matrix has cells that are actively undergoing cell division. Surrounding the nails are folded areas of skin called the proximal nail fold. Proximal to the nail fold, you'll find the eponychium, also known as the cuticle. On the distant end of the nail, you'll find the hyponychium. The lunula is a half-shaped moon area of the nail that has accumulated keratin. The nails grow within the matrix of the nail, and just like the hair, the cells in the nails keratinize and die off as they are pushed upward away from the supply of blood. On average, fingernails grow about 1/2 millimeter per week, but the growth for toenails is slower. As the nail grows from the matrix, it projects outward toward the fingertip. However, too much pressure can cause the nail to grow into the tissue surrounding the nail. This causes a condition called an ingrown nail. Symptoms can include pain, inflammation, softening of the nail, or even an infection. An ingrown nail is an easily treatable condition. There are 2 basic types of glands found in the skin. There are sweat glands, also known as sudoriferous glands, and these glands produce sweat. Then there are sebaceous glands that produce sebum, also known as oil. Sudoriferous sweat glands have 4 types. There are eccrine sweat glands. In these type of glands, sweat exits through a duct and leaves through a tiny sweat pore. Sweat excreted from these glands secrete antimicrobial agents to fight against the growth of pathogens on the skin. They also function in thermal regulation, because remember, if the body gets too hot, it'll begin to release sweat. There are apocrine glands that are found in the anal area and the areolas. Apocrine glands excrete sweat into hair follicles instead of a pore. The sweat these glands release is odorless. However, once the sweat is secreted, bacteria on the skin will metabolize the sweat, which causes an odor. Ceruminous glands are found in the ear. They release a thick secretion called cerumen, also known as earwax. Cerumen lubricates the eardrum and traps particles to stop them from reaching the eardrum. Mammary glands are sweat glands that secrete milk. They contain all the compounds needed to nourish a newborn. Sebaceous glands are small ducts with secretory cells named Acini cells surrounding them. They usually empty into a hair follicle but may sometimes empty into small pores. Sebaceous glands produce sebum, also known as oil. And sebum is a mixture of lipids and cell fragments that retain moisture in the skin and the hair. But some bacteria can thrive in sebum, causing a blackhead to become infected with bacteria. This causes something we know as a pimple or a bump. So let's end this lecture with some skin pathology. Wounds are the most common type of skin pathology. A wound can damage the epidermis, the dermis, or even deeper tissues. Wounds can be anything from lacerations, also known as cuts, burns, hair. So let's quickly jump into skin pathology, starting with burns. A burn is a skin wound that can be caused by extreme heat, extreme cold, electricity, also known as superficial burns. They're the most minor and only damage the first layer of the skin, which is the epidermis. Symptoms can vary from redness and minor pain, but there are no blisters or permanent damage. In some or all of the dermis. Second-degree burns may result in blistering, pain, and scarring. Medical treatment is going to be needed for this type of wound. Third-degree burns, the most damaging type of burn, results in all 3 layers of the skin being damaged. Are damaged too. Third-degree burns usually don't involve any pain because the nerves are too damaged to feel any pain. They do result in loss of hair follicles in the wounded area, loss of keratin production, and significant scarring. And due to the large patients usually end up being dehydrated from fluid loss. Treatment for third-degree burns is needed, but patients may have to require a skin grafting procedure. Cancer is another type of skin wound. It's caused due to mutations in the DNA that causes the cell to lose control over its cell cycle. This usually leads to a tumor, which is a cluster of undifferentiated cells. All cancerous tumors are classified by their ability to metastasize, which is pretty much their ability to spread to other tissues in the body through either the cardiovascular system or the lymphatic system. And when this happens, a tumor cell will grow in a new area of the body, alter their structure, and disrupt the tissue from functioning properly. There is basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and malignant melanoma. Induce cancer. And an example of a carcinogen agent would be the toxins found inside of cigarettes. So let's take a look at them, starting with basal cell carcinoma. Basal cell carcinoma is the most common type of skin cancer. It's a cancer of the keratinocytes in the stratum basale of the epidermis. This type of cancer is usually found on the type of skin that is frequently exposed to UV radiation and forms a nodule with a central crater that also and neck, and it forms scaly plaques that bleed and ulcerate. Squamous cell carcinoma is more likely to metastasize than basal cell carcinoma, but it still can be treated with surgery. Has a greater tendency of metastasizing than other cell cancers. This is because cancerous melanocytes have arms that extend down and access the blood vessels in the bloodstream. This cancer is also treated with surgical excision, chemotherapy, or radiation therapy. Early detection of malignant melanoma is important. Other skin cancers or normal moles. A melanoma has jagged edges or blurriness. C for color. Melanoma cancerous moles usually have a blue or black color. D for diameter. A melanoma is usually larger than 6 millimeters and can be compared always changing in shape and size. Well, that's the end of our lecture on the integumentary system. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Always feel free to send video requests, and I will see you guys